Hi, today we're covering something rather odd. A group that maliciously targeted trains with a chemical weapon, yet is still allowed to exist. This is Aum Shinrikyo. Cults are a rather weird thing, in the fact that most people recognize that they believe in some seriously crazy stuff. Yet somehow, they are able to attract a lot of attention and followers, gaining popularity much quicker than even some religions. But if we're all honest, they never really end well. From Jonestown to the Branch Davidians, the Anthill Kids to Aum Shinrikyo. But to find out more about this cult, we have to start with its leader. So let's talk about Shoko Asahara. Born on March 2nd, 1955, at the time he was not known by that name. He was originally Chizuru Matsumoto, and he came from a rather big family. But they were impoverished, so life really wasn't easy for him. To make things even worse, he had infantile glaucoma, which left him blind in one eye and mostly blind in the other. This led him to having been placed in a school for the blind, and apparently even with his situation, he was not exactly a model student. Eyewitnesses would say that he was a rather big bully, picking fights with other kids. Not only was he blind, but he was also taking from the blind. After he finished schooling, Shoko Asahara would go on to take up acupuncture and traditional medicine. He would even settle down and tie the knot with a woman. And with her he would sire 6 kids. But here's where things took a turn for the worst. In 1981 he would be busted for selling unlicensed drugs, and it would land him a conviction for practicing pharmacy without a license. But as I say, every cloud has a silver lining, because around this time he started diving really deep into different religions and spiritual teachings, not just from Japan, but from all around the world. He discovered religiosity like many who are incarcerated eventually do, and he had been renowned for being incredibly good at absorbing all the information he could. And if it had stopped there, it would be rather commendable. However, we weren't so lucky. Allow me to paint a picture so you can take in the absurdity of how it all started. In 1984, from his one-bedroom home in Tokyo's Shibuya ward, the now named Shoko Asahara got this incredible idea to kickstart a brand new religious movement with him at the center of it all. And he called it Aum Shinrikyo, which translates to the religion of truth, or the universal supreme truth. And it was due to this that he decided to ditch his old name, Chizuru Matsumoto, and adopt the much more commanding name of Shoko Asahara. Eventually he would even consider himself the reincarnation of the Christ. Now, one of the first things he had to do was convince the government to allow this, and it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Shoko would have to jump through a series of serious hoops in order to get Aum Shinrikyo officially recognized as a legitimate religion. But apparently the man had the persistence, and eventually he got the green light to label Aum Shinrikyo as a legitimate religious corporation. But here's where things get really weird. Aum Shinrikyo wasn't your run-of-the-mill faith. No, it was rather a religious buffet, taking bits and pieces and essentially forming a collage of religions, taking from everything. Christianity to Buddhism to Shintoism to even communism, and every other spiritual tradition which Shoko Asahara had learned, even taking aspects from yoga, which seems to be a surprise to many is an actual part of a religion, and Nostradamus himself. Stranger still, he even included teachings and philosophy from Isaac Asimov's sci-fi novels. And as it turns out, Shoko Asahara had a thing about making rather bold claims and statements. He would go so far as to state he had the power to heal the sick, cure the lame, and even take people's sins away, using this mystic mumbo-jumbo that was vaguely explained as him being able to absorb all the bad in someone, and that he had been set upon the world to absorb all the sins of the people in order to save them from an impending doom. And I mean, doomsday cults had been a rather big thing at the time, so it makes sense he would adopt some aspects of that too. And what was this impending doom? Well, according to Shoko Asahara, the world was headed to a nuclear apocalypse. And who did he say were the culprits? None other than the Americans, along with a laundry list of others who he seemed to have some amount of personal gripes against. He would point fingers at other Japanese religions, the British royal family, and even the Dutch. He even blamed the Freemasons. And what type of world-spanning conspiracy could you have without including blaming the Jews for something? So Shoko claims he had a vision, and claimed he was the only one who could save the world, all through Aum Shinrikyo. And all you had to do to be saved and become enlightened, to make it through the impending apocalypse, was to join him and follow his religious sect. And this was so you could be a part of those who survived to rebuild society, all based on his teachings. But what made him the chosen, you ask? Well, according to him, he was the second coming, and he would eventually publicly declare himself as the Christ. The man certainly had an ego, and he was able to convince people of this. But I mean, there's currently a religion who convinces people when their belief is structured around being possessed by aliens and the great journey of Xenu, currently existing in the United States. So some Japanese blind man declaring himself the Christ does not seem that far-fetched by comparison. And while seeing that now it was a religion, it just needed followers, or more followers. So Aum Shinrikyo's PR team went into overdrive as they churned out all sorts of media, from videos preaching the gospel of Aum Shinrikyo to clips of Shoko Asahara himself spouting what was meant to be words of wisdom. And eventually, like many a cult, they would hit the road, doing public speaking gigs, fancy dinner services, all the while presenting themselves to be the religion of the enlightened. And here's where things get really bizarre. It appears that followers were paying large amounts of money for blessings, going so far as to even requesting to sip his blood, and being allowed to, drinking tea brewed from his hair, and it didn't stop there. They were also able to snag some primetime TV slots, spreading the gospel of their wacky religion to the masses, including strange yoga sessions, informative displays, and for some reason, really off-putting dance numbers. But I mean, those weren't all too uncommon at the time. Aum Shinrikyo's PR team had an ace up their sleeve. They really pulled out the big guns with this. They made their own anime, and they broadcast it. And believe it or not, all this weirdness worked. Despite the sheer absurdity of their PR blitz and the downright bonkers beliefs the man peddled, people were buying into it like hotcakes. A lot of people, and I mean a lot of people. Aum Shinrikyo would swell to about 10,000 members. Now that may not seem as big as many other cults, but this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill, poor, downtrodden, disenfranchised who joined a cult. No, they attracted some seriously wealthy individuals, many of whom sported some of the highest and most prestigious degrees from Japan's top universities. Suddenly, Aum Shinrikyo wasn't looking like a cult anymore, but rather the religion of the elite. And with that came wealth. Wealth beyond Shoko Asahara's wildest dreams. And as the cult was now on the up and up, it would continue to gain more and more members. And in traditional cult fashion, as people signed up, they were asked to sign over all their wealth and belongings to Aum Shinrikyo, and in particular, allowing Shoko to have access to it. But that's not all. All the while this was happening, and the group was gaining more members, they began to do public spectacles in order to flaunt their so-called magical powers, including but not limited to going without food or water for days, dunking themselves in scalding hot water, and even burying themselves alive for 6 whole days, in a matter similar to Shokoshi no Butsu, which Shoko likely heard of and borrowed the religious aspects of that ritual. But it doesn't end there. It seems that Shoko was not happy just with the religious. He wanted a piece of the big pie, where the big money lay, in politics. So, members of Aum Shinrikyo would run for the Japanese parliament. However, their campaign primarily revolved around the same acts and practices which had gained them many members. In essence, they were a traveling roadshow, dancing, singing, preaching Aum Shinrikyo's gospel, and attempting to display their magical powers. However, this was near the height of the Cold War, which meant there were certain powers Shoko could align himself with, which would give him further prominence and power. So off he went to Russia in order to gain Russia's backing, all the while attempting to spread the cult's reach even further. And wouldn't you know it, like magic, 30,000 new recruits would sign up straight out of Russia. And weirdly enough, the resources would be spread between Shoko and the government, as they completely and totally voluntarily joined the religion, as it supposedly spread like wildfire. However, Shoko wasn't just hanging out and spreading the gospel with his new Russian recruits. He was making serious inroads into Russia's government through slick networking and well-placed bribes. He would manage to cozy up to some rather powerful Russian government officials, and they began to plan. As this was going on, things in Japan were heating up. People were getting legitimately concerned about the cult's antics, as Aum Shinrikyo began running hospitals themselves and turning them into money traps, luring in folks for treatment, which was supposedly meant to be rather cheap, only to hit them with massive medical bills afterwards, forcing them to surrender all their wealth to Aum Shinrikyo and join up. However, it seems that power was getting to the cult's head, since anyone who dared speak out against the cult or even hinted at leaving would mysteriously vanish. And by 1992, public suspicion was at an all-time high. In particular, when Aum Shinrikyo managed to snag a building in downtown Tokyo, and this time alarm bells were ringing in the heads of a myriad of individuals, since this building had essentially become almost like a fortress, with all the windows blacked out and the doors being rather thick, people coming in and out at all times of the day. All the while, cult members were heavily guarding the place and refusing to talk about what was going on the inside. However, it doesn't seem like the people of Tokyo really cared that Aum Shinrikyo wanted their privacy. They just weren't having it. So a myriad of individuals began keeping a close eye on the building, taking pictures of anything fishy going on, and they found plenty. Strange equipment, rather large boxes with Cyrillic writing on them, and a myriad of curious packages being delivered at all times. Then one fateful night, it seemed a smell so awful, so horrible, hit the neighborhood that it caused people to physically start gagging and heaving. And the smell was traced back to Aum Shinrikyo's building, and this is when hell broke loose. Residents were angrily swarming the place, demanding answers, to the point that they even managed to corner Shoko Asahara himself, as he attempted to flee in a fancy up-armored Mercedes. Almost like a Frankenstein's monster situation, except you don't feel bad about the monster in this situation. And things would continue to get more suspicious, as it took a whopping 2 weeks for inspectors to finally show up, in order to check out Aum Shinrikyo's building. But then it appears that they found nothing. It was completely empty. Almost as if they had gotten a heads up, or the officials had delayed investigations just long enough to completely empty out a full building. Whatever shady project they had going on in there just up and vanished. Almost overnight, the cult would relocate their operations to a more secluded area far away from highly populated residences. Weirdly enough, chaos would begin to erupt around Matsumoto, a rather nice city, which it seems became the new home of Aum Shinrikyo. And then, out of nowhere, chaos would erupt, where an apartment block was woken up to an incredibly atrocious smell. And before anybody could figure out what was going on, people began dropping like flies, passing out left and right, and some even died. It was sheer pandemonium, as 7 were now dead, and hundreds more were in the ER, or receiving other types of intensive medical care. But what is important about this is that apartment block in particular turned out to be the home of not 1, not 2, but 3 judges overseeing land disputes involving none other than Aum Shinrikyo. And now most people would be pretty confident to say that Aum Shinrikyo had been causing this chaos intentionally. However, strangely enough, the police and the Japanese intelligence services weren't looking at Aum Shinrikyo. They were dead set on pinning this attack on North Korea. Meanwhile, Shoko Asahara got wind that the heat was coming his way once again, as the police were supposedly gearing up to investigate him and his group, leading to him deciding to pull a fast one. On March 20th, 1995, Shoko would put his plan into action, well ahead of schedule, as he sent 5 cult members to board separate trains cruising through Kasumigazeki and Nagatacho, right by the Japanese parliament. And what was so important about these 5 men? Each one of them was carrying around an umbrella with a pointed tip, and each one was carrying a package wrapped in newspaper. And what was inside that package, you ask? Well, 2 sealed bags of chemicals, ready to be mixed and unleashed, creating the deadly sarin gas. While these guys were on the train, they set their packages down on the floor. And just before they were about to leave, they were to jab the packages with the pointed tips on their umbrellas and flee, as the doors closed and the trains chugged along. All the while, the packages would spread the deadly sarin gas. And once they did this, and the gas started enveloping the train cars, filling them with toxic fumes, all those unfortunate enough to be on the targeted trains would start coughing, choking, going blind, and even passing out. And it seemed it did not stop at those specific cars. As the gas spread, so did the chaos. By the time the trains rolled onto their final destinations, right by the Japanese parliament, things were in full panic mode. People were bailing out of the affected train cars, while station staff scrambled to help the unconscious and hurt passengers. It was chaos, pure and simple. And when the chaos broke out on those trains, staff, bless their hearts, took action. But their idea of action wasn't particularly a stroke of genius. Instead of evacuating just the affected cars, they went ahead and cleared all the other train cars as well, and they set the train chugging along its merry way. And while this inherently wasn't wrong, that just meant that the sarin gas packages were still on board, all the while contaminating every train station along the way. In some cases, train staff along the way decided to be rather bold and brave, yanking these packages out. However, unfortunately enough, instead of disposing of them or covering them in something that would keep the gas from spreading, they just left them lying around the platform. All the while, innocent bystanders were unknowingly milling about right around where the gas was spreading. Eventually, one of the train staff would collapse, and his buddies scooped him up and shuffled him along into a back room with a handful of other individuals. And unfortunately, things would only get worse, as one of the train staff decided to bring along one of the packages, and he put it in the same room that was filled with individuals and the passed out worker. Next thing they knew, everybody in that tight, cramped space got hit with a poisonous gas. You have to cut them some slack. They were completely clueless about what was going on. And can you blame them? This would be Japan's first ever serious chemical attack since World War II. And it was completely uncharted territory, so there was no training for something like this. But we have to give credit where credit is due. Japanese emergency services and the Special Defense Force wasted no time immobilizing, as they suited up in full hazmat gear, and then it became a race against time to contain the chaos and save as many lives as they could. In many cults, the people conducting such an act would be clueless idiots, but these guys weren't. 2 of them had degrees in applied physics, and another one had an honorary degree on the same field. Another had a degree focused on technology, and the last individual responsible for this attack was a senior cardiologist. So they knew exactly what they were doing, and exactly what this chemical would do to others. And after they did their dirty work on the trains, they didn't just vanish into thin air. Waiting for them outside the train stations would be fellow cult members along with getaway vehicles, each one ready to whisk them away to a different location. And as further proof that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were not just innocent idiots tricked by the cult, each of these 5 perpetrators was carrying around sarin antidote needles. Some of them even had to jab themselves with the antidote because they had accidentally exposed themselves to the poison. And after this little escapade, all 5 culprits would eventually regroup at Aum Shinrikyo's headquarters, probably thinking that they were in for some celebration as they would be set about as heroes, and they would get away with it like they had been getting away with things for years. But boy were they wrong. The police, the military, and the Japanese government were beyond furious at this, so they didn't waste a single second, and they stormed in, completely disregarding almost any and all legal protections that Aum Shinrikyo was used to getting, taking everything they could out on their way. Bank accounts, equipment, property, all of it. Aum Shinrikyo had 25 of its properties and buildings hit simultaneously, and every single member's home would be raided, and this massive operation involved 2,500 police and Special Defense Force personnel. And they weren't messing around. they arrested over 400 cult members on the spot and took custody of 50 children. But the crackdown did not stop there. Over 500 raids would be carried out in total, and the public was livid. During one of these arrests, a regular citizen, fueled by unremittent rage over the sarin attacks, would take matters into their own hands in some rather cathartic vigilante justice, killing a cult member brutally right in front of the police and the rest of the crowd. But it seemed no one was upset about it. It was pure and unadulterated chaos. And over the next few months, what remained of Aum Shinrikyo on the outside would attempt 4 more metro attacks. But fortunately for all those involved, they failed spectacularly. In 2 of the failed attempts, instead of using sarin gas, they went after the police chief who had led the crackdown at his home, as he got ambushed right outside of his house, leading to the cult member to take 4 servings of lead. But miraculously, he survived. So not only did he fail at taking out his target, but he would be paraded around as a trophy, showing off the failure of Aum Shinrikyo for all to see. However, the cult would not stop there. They would also send a letter bomb to the Tokyo governor. Unfortunately, this bomb was successful in a way, but rather than the governor, his secretary took the blast to the face. Fortunately, she survived, though I doubt she was very happy about the explosive exfoliation she was given after chasing him for a rather prolonged period of time and a bunch of raids. Eventually, the government was able to nab Shoko Asahara, and they quickly started to build their case. And my god, they had an abundance of evidence. Every place the police had raided was filled with documents, laying out the cult's every secret. They seemed to be so cocky that they did not destroy any evidence, or were only able to destroy a minute amount of evidence. And as it turns out, Asahara was swimming in money. The man, in essence, was a billionaire. And when they raided the chemical labs, they hit a jackpot. Not only were they creating sarin gas, but they were also creating botulinum toxin, anthrax, and VX nerve gas, one of the deadliest nerve agents imaginable. However, the further they chased the cult along, the deeper the rabbit hole went. And amongst the documents, the police stumbled upon numerous of reportings of ex-cult members and their families disappearing mysteriously, as their assets were forfeited to the cult. And as it wound up, they were being kidnapped, forced to transfer their property, then killed by the cult. However, that's not even the most egregious thing that they attempted. The cult had legitimately attempted to slay the Japanese royal family through the spread of toxins near the royal palace, but this wound up being a failed assassination attempt, as they seemed too incompetent to succeed. And remember that attack that I mentioned in Matsumoto City? That was a cult, and they had been using refrigerator trucks in order to spread the gas around the neighborhood, attempting to take out the judges in the land dispute cases. And it seems that they trace these chemicals to also having been in their Tokyo building, meaning they had been making these chemicals and using them all the way back then. And how did the cult stay ahead of everyone every time they were being chased? Within the records, the cult had evidence that showed that they had members infiltrating Japanese security services, police, and special defense force, who were all feeding them intel in order to be able to avoid the police. And now with the information, they were able to find out why they had attacked with the gas, and why they were creating VX gas in particular. The intent was to blame it on the US in order to spark the nuclear war, which Shoko believed had to happen for his cult to take power. This was largely because that after being invented and further tested by the British military, the information on how to create it was passed down to the US government, who had created a full-scale VX gas operation as a deterrent against invasion. Meaning that once the sarin attacks were done and they implemented the VX gas, Aum Shinrikyo would be able to point the finger at America and cause a full-scale war to begin, causing Shoko Asahara's doomsday prophecies to become reality. But that's not all. It gets even crazier. Apparently, while Shoko had been in Russia, it turns out he had taken a large amount of his followers with him in order to have them trained by Russian special forces in the use of weapons and military tactics. But why all this training? Well, it seems that Shoko was able to import what would be a dream to any AK guy. Scores of Russian-made AKs, RPGs, pallets of ammo, as far as the eye could see, and even a Russian military helicopter. all given to him by Russia's military. This was in large part due to what had been going on in Russia during the 90s, which allowed anybody with enough money to get whatever they wanted, all short of a nuclear weapon. And what was all this equipment for? Well, as it turns out, they had intended to use the Russian-trained commandos and the helicopter, the RPGs, and the AKs to storm the Japanese imperial palace and assassinate the royal family. Though how they would be able to pin this on the Americans, I haven't the foggiest. And with all this information, the trial of Shoko Asahara and Aum Shinrikyo would kick off, lasting a whopping 8 years, as hundreds upon hundreds of cult members would be convicted for a laundry list of crimes, and the 5 guys who pulled off the metro attacks were all sentenced to death. However, the 5th one would strike a deal, as he would squeal and testify against his compatriots, meaning that rather than a short drop and a quick stop, he got life behind bars instead. As for Shoko Asahara, the death sentence. However, there were those who would not accept this. His daughter, who would remain anonymous for a rather long time, eventually came forward campaigning for her father to get a retrial, arguing that his trial was originally not fair and he wasn't given his due, in large part because of his mental illness. Despite her efforts, Shoko Asahara would be executed by hanging. Even after all this, Aum Shinrikyo still exists today, albeit they're singing a different tune. At least one faction is made up members of the original organization, and they are public-facingly very apologetic about their past attacks and their actions, as they have now renounced and denounced not only Asahara, but the actions of all the cult members, all the while attempting to adhere to the more positive teachings while staying away from controversy. However, this group is a mere shadow of what it once was. As of 2021, the faction boasted around 1,650 members within Japan. However, reports suggest that there's ongoing recruitment. Additionally, this group continues to collect donations, tithes, and sells items and materials to its members. In conclusion, the story of Aum Shinrikyo serves as a chilling reminder to the dangers of extremism and the consequences of following a cult. And while baffling, the group may still exist even though its original leaders were brought to justice, which seems to be quite different, since many of these doomsday cults who act upon their beliefs often wind up no longer existing, prompting many within Japan to stay rather vigilant of this and other fanatical groups. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.